deep dive into the impact of growing up in a dysfunctional family. And today we are diving deep with queen, icon, legend, Tian Dayton, one of the pioneers of the adult child movement. She was at ground zero, y'all, when all this shit began. Tian has saved the lives of so many people, including my own. Her books have played a significant role in my healing journey. In particular, her book, The ACOA Trauma Syndrome. And it was through reading this book that I realized I was suffering from a form of PTSD, and that feeling I've talked so much about, and the uncontrollable, irrational emotions, the insane thinking and behavior, the way my peace of mind got hijacked whenever I was in a relationship, were all, in fact, a post-traumatic stress response. And I will be diving into this with Tian, as well as a myriad of other topics. This conversation is filled with gems of wisdom, so let's not waste any more time.
So freaking excited to introduce our guest. We have Tian Dayton, who has had a 40-plus year career doing the Lord's work. She is a nationally renowned speaker, expert in psychodrama, trauma, addiction, adult children, and self-help related issues. She is the senior fellow at the Meadows, author of over 15 books, including two of my faves, the ACOA Trauma Syndrome and Emotional Sobriety. And she has developed an approach for incorporating experiential work into treatment programs and group work, which is called Relationship Trauma Repair, RTR. Hi, Tian.
Hi, Ashley.
So glad that you're here.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, so I've heard you share that you grew up with an alcoholic father. And I've also heard you talk about your first adult child aha moment, which, you first began to see the serious impact your upbringing had on you. This moment was very similar to mine. So I was hoping that you could share a little bit about that aha moment.
So remind me of which aha moment.
It was get in the fight with your husband.
Oh, right. Okay. So that was an aha moment that, I'll back it up a little bit. I'm married. I was 23 when I met my husband. He was 24. We married when we were 20, when I was 25 and he was 26. And when I was 27, we had our first child. We were in New York City. We lived in the Poconos at the time. Mm-hmm. But we had matched families. His mother was alcoholic. My father was alcoholic. And I had a typical sort of alcoholic child experience visiting his mother, whom I loved, wonderful woman, but an alcoholic. So there were all those gaslighting crazy, will she be sober? Is she drunk? Is she on anything? Is she not? Is this normal? Is it not? And anyway, I left early this visit because my husband was doing some work in New York and had to stay. Took my daughter back to Pennsylvania, basically in a snowstorm. So when I say I left early, I really got back to our little farmhouse and found on my shelf, knew this was alcoholic related, but remember there's no term like ACOA. There's not the thought that children are really impacted by this at this stage. I mean, this is a long time ago. And so I had a book that a fellow, Wheelock Whitney, who helped to start the Johnson Institute in Minneapolis, and was on the board of Hazelden and so on. So he was part of that early movement. And it was called I'll Quit Tomorrow by Vern Johnson. Mm. And I read it twice while taking care of a baby. So I was desperate for knowledge. And what I took out of it was that I didn't drink. Neither my husband and I drank at all. But we still had what looked like dry drunk behaviors. Mm-hmm. And all I knew was that I was damaged by the experience of growing up with alcoholism, and that we both had the kinds of behaviors that an alcoholic exhibits, only we were cold sober. So I started to do the 12 steps on my own. I had already tried going to AA and stuff like that with a friend encouraging me to. I literally never drank, but I was so open to anything possibly being wrong with me that I checked out an AA meeting. And at the end of the meeting, this man looked at me and said, I think there's a meeting down the hall you belong in. It's called Al-Anon. And I did some Al-Anon, and then we made this move to an area where there wasn't too much of that. And so I had awareness. My mother had been in Al-Anon, but I started working the 12 steps for something that had no name at that point. Mm-hmm. And later, it did get a name. And it wasn't that much later. I mean, I was 27 here. When I was, I think, 30 or 31, there was the first Adult Children of Alcoholics conference in Orlando, and my husband and I went to it. And it was really a movement that was begun by a chance meeting between Janet Wojtitz and Gary Seidler, then owning Health Communications. And Janet had a dissertation about it, something she called Adult Children of Alcoholics. They published that book, and a no-name publishing company became a success. This book went on to the New York Times bestseller list for 2 years. So we started coming out of the woodwork as ACOAs.
So was that the first time that you heard the term, was when you went to that conference, Adult Child?
Yeah. I mean, I read her book before that. So I was hearing the term, but that's when it was born, really. And my moment, you did ask me about a moment, and it was in a fight with my husband. And I remember pausing in the fight and thinking, we are acting like we're drunk, but we drink nothing. And something is wrong with us that we don't understand. And also I knew that I didn't really want to change my life. I liked my life. It seemed like it was inside of me and inside of him.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's amazing that you guys were both able to go on this journey together, I'm assuming.
I know. Yeah. We must have taken our little daughter with us because we didn't leave her. So I and there it was. Suddenly a conference full of information, full of paths out. But the most important thing was to name it, to say, this is something that is wrong with you. And what I did with the ACOA trauma syndrome was really follow Janet's book. And then I followed it again and Gary told the story of meeting Janet in The Soulful Journey of Recovery. But I connected when the trauma information came out in the 80s, I came to understand that the ACOA syndrome is a post-traumatic stress disorder in which pain from childhood is being triggered and lived out in adulthood. It may be dormant. And that's the confusing thing with ACOAs. We get out of our houses and think we leave the disease behind. But these kinds of diseases are state dependent. So what triggers it are like experiences. In the same way a soldier might hit the deck when he hears a car backfire because he associates the sound with gunfire, though he's in a Chicago parking lot, not Vietnam, sort of a thing. And ACOA will produce, pretty normally. But then when we get into intimate relationships and try to raise children and be a family, that is our car backfiring.
Yeah, I was really blown away when I finally realized that I was actually having trauma triggers and attacks. And for me, this all showed up for me in dating. But I was just blown away. Like, for so many years, I had no idea, like, if I didn't receive a text message back in 30 minutes or, whatever, just the amount of gut-wrenching, debilitating anxiety. And I thought I was just like a pathetic loser, and I couldn't understand like why my emotional reactions were so strong. And to realize that adult children suffer from PTSD or complex PTSD. I mean, at first I just thought I felt a little bit silly saying it at first, or that it was, like a little bit of a crutch. But I was hoping, could you explain a little bit what complex PTSD is compared to regular old PTSD?
Well, this stuff happens on an arc, right? There are ACOAs who have varying degrees of reaction, some more than others.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the factors that I look at with people is what were their buffering experiences. In my own life, I had a wonderful grandmother. I was close to my church, which was a very supportive, sustaining community. I lived in Minneapolis, Minnesota, which was a very solid world. I had friends at school. I had a job. I had many, many surrounding factors that were stable. School was stable. Mm-hmm. So that as my home became very unstable, there were other parts of my world I could lean into. Mm-hmm. This is a huge factor in why some people do better than others. So I wouldn't take any one set of symptoms and say that that's how your set would not necessarily apply to another ACOA. But for symptomatology, in the book, I create my own list. And on that list are things like at the top of it, emotional regulation is a big one, right? That's part of complex PTSD, but it's also just part of the ACOA trauma syndrome that we have trouble regulating our responses. We get triggered, we go from 0 to 10 and 10 to 0 without any speed bumps in between, which is why I wrote Emotional Sobriety, because we need to learn to live in 4, 5, and 6. ACOAs bond with these other either intense shutdown states or high intensity states, and we go shooting back and forth between the two. And we don't recognize ourselves in 4, 5, and 6 sometimes. We don't function as easily. Now, that said, every ACOA is different, but when I see extremes or black and white thinking or rigid thinking, I look for trauma. And once you resolve that, the thinking, feeling, and behavior starts to sort itself out a little bit. So emotional regulation is big, anxiety, depression, somatic, we somatize, right? Mm-hmm. We don't talk about our feelings. Our body holds our feelings and our body does the talking for us. Our back hurts. We get diseases. I mean, physical ailments, that is very linked to trauma, physical ailments. Trying to think of some of the other more common ones. Mistrust can be a real part of it, and mistrust of things going smoothly.
Waiting for the other shoe to drop.
Hypervigilance, very good. Yeah, hypervigilance is part and parcel of the trauma syndrome because we spend, and this is where I think the codependency develops. And you allude to that in your story. When you have an alcoholic parent and you're the one who's in charge of them, you were put in charge of your mother, I was put in charge of my father. Although that didn't matter, my mother was just as tricky to deal with because she was such an enabler and so codependent and in there. But as kids, what we learn to do is read our parents' faces for signs of danger. We become hypervigilant. And a raised eyebrow, a change in eye gaze, a sudden movement, fighting, silence can be very triggering for someone who has been traumatized as a child in a home where there is, a dysfunctional home often alternates between chaos and avoidance. Mm-hmm. Chaos and avoidance. It's chaotic, and then everybody slams doors, disappears into their bedrooms, and comes out when they're calmed down and smiling again.
Yeah, as if nothing ever happened.
Nothing ever happened. Right. Nothing ever happened. So it never gets talked about and worked out. If it gets talked about and worked out, you grow. That's how you learn and grow emotionally and become a stronger, better person. But when it is never talked about, it just goes underground and it affects your self-image because you start thinking you're the one with the problem. Mm-hmm. And if you do try to talk about it, your parent, confirms that and says, what are you talking about? You're the one with the problem. I'm fine. Because the denial that is part of the system of alcoholism is so powerful that nothing can stay alive in its you don't get to have anything but denial. I mean, we're seeing that on a national scale now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, denial of reality. The virus isn't bad, whatever. And that's very damaging. It's very damaging.
Mm-hmm. I think that many more people probably are familiar with the term codependency as compared to adult child. Codependent No More has 8,000 reviews on Amazon compared to the ACA Big Red Book, which has about only 1,000. But I think many people would be shocked to learn that codependency was actually an offshoot of the ACA movement. And I was hoping you could talk a little bit about that.
Well, codependency, the original 12-step model is the addict and the para-addict, the alcoholic and the para-alcoholic, the alcoholic and the co-alcoholic, co-addict, who was, in tandem with the alcoholic. We now refer to that person as the enabler. But originally it was codependent. So codependency became a sort of a catch-all for someone who exhibited traits similar to addiction, but that maybe wasn't addicted to alcohol or drugs. So to everyone's great surprise, that term just went gangbusters through, and it's been around a long time, which is the other reason it has so many reviews. Codependent hit in the mid 80s, I think it was, and Bradshaw, there's a coterie of people who started using that term and making it quite famous. Mm-hmm. But the other, if ACOA drew people out of the woodwork, codependent drew everybody out of the woodwork. And of course, the beauty of that is that we can identify as something our darker sides that we're more ashamed of. The downside of that is that we start identifying as a thing, instead of getting more particular in being the individual we are, So codependency is, here's my concern about codependency. I see it as trauma-based. I see it as fundamentally a product of hypervigilance, that we are so used to making something outside of ourselves more central than what's inside of ourselves, that we base our own thinking, feeling, behavior on what's outside of ourselves, right? If somebody else is in a good mood, we're in a good mood. If somebody's scared, we get anxious. We don't center ourselves in our own inner resources. We wait for something outside of ourselves to tell us who to be ourselves or within ourselves. And so I see codependency as trauma-based. A lot of people see it as a cluster of characteristics. And then the implication is if I just change these characteristics, I'll be less codependent. I think resolving the trauma, resolving the hypervigilance, the anxiety, and really understanding its origins is a more lasting way to get over codependency. That is my thought. Because otherwise we erect all these boundaries, right? And we think, people have trouble who are ACOAs and codependents having intimacy. And they start, we go from having no boundaries to too many boundaries.
Yeah.
So there's no easy solution to this stuff. Resolving the wounds is where it's at, I think.
Well, yeah, exactly. And I talk about, for me, I had the realization that my dating issues were related to my upbringing, but then just having that awareness on its own wasn't sufficient enough to produce any sort of internal changes. My next relationship ended up being even crazier than ever. And that's because I hadn't really taken a good look at the causes and conditions, and done that that rewiring, that reprogramming. Now, when did for adult? Go ahead. Of course.
I think the relationship codependents and ACOs need to focus on is the one with themselves. That we have to recognize our tendency to project, to reenact, and to transfer our past onto our present. Mm-hmm. It's hard to tolerate the kind of pain that we've gone through as children in a painful home and just feel it and live through feeling it without attaching it to what triggered it. Here's why that happens. When we're traumatized, our thinking mind shuts down and our limbic world revs up. our limbic world is in charge of emotions and sense impressions. So if our limbic system is all revved up, we are picking up on all the sense impressions in the environment, the sights, the sounds, the smells, the tastes, all of that. And we're feeling feelings very strongly, but we have no storyline because our thinking mind is shut down. That's because it's a part of the fight-flight response, and we're not meant to think. We're meant to run. We're meant to react. That's good if you're being, if a truck is coming at you, you want to get out of the way. It's not so good if it's a repeated cumulative experience of a terrifying parent. And why do children get so scared in their home? We are little, they're big. They have the power, we're dependent. We are children with the developmental capacity for thinking that we have at a varying age. Children are fundamentally egocentric. If there's a problem in the house, we think we did it. And then if we have a parent who reinforces that and tells us we did it, we're in big trouble self-image wise. We're in a home that is not helping us talk through and work out what we're seeing. More often, it's telling us we're wrong. What we see and what we sense is wrong. So we learn to doubt our own perceptions. That is part of why our dependency and our feeling that we can't escape, and our sense of helplessness because our size, vis-a-vis and power relation vis-a-vis the adults in the home, make us more vulnerable to trauma. An older kid, depending on when your parent was an addicted person or an off person, can be part of how affected you are. If in your young developmental years your parent was quite sick and you had no buffering factors, then you can get quite sick in that experience, quite traumatized. And your self-image is affected, your ability to regulate your emotions is affected, your ability to be comfortable in intimate relationships is affected. And all that needs cleaning up, or it leaks out into the relationships we form later. And we make it about the relationship because it's too hard to tolerate the feelings that get aroused in us when we try to attach to somebody. They're attachment issues. We need to work through those kinds of attachment issues so that we can attach in a healthier way. And nothing's perfect, but what we need to do when we do attach, if we've made a fairly good choice, and it's not a person who is, we want to say it's the person, I've got I'm not good at choosing. Yeah, but it's not always that. We're also not good at being in intimate relationships. It's some of both. I mean, there's no perfect person out there to find, especially if we're not perfect. We're going to find people sort of at our own level. To wait for a perfect person to come along and then to get suspicious when things get difficult means you're going to have trouble ever being in an intimate relationship because an intimate relationship is difficult. It's very difficult to be really close to somebody because it requires that both people really own their own reactions. And before they project them on each other, try to take responsibility for what's going on in them. That's where the rubber meets the road in intimacy, I think.
Two questions. One, I really minimized the impact of my upbringing because I was always taken care of. I had never been, physically or sexually abused. And so my understanding was that others had surely had it much worse than I had. And then, to piggyback on that, I've also wondered, I was very, very consciously aware of what was going on in my home. And I'm wondering, does that have any more or less of an impact on a child who maybe only has unconscious awareness of the dysfunction?
I can make generalizations about the ACOA experience.
Yeah.
For give you a good answer to this, I would need to spend and really understand your experience and tease out all the little ramifications. And if I give you an easy answer to it,
it's not going to
go away and apply that easy answer to themselves. This is the resistance to therapy ACO. I'm not saying you have this, obviously you don't, but ACOAs don't want to do that hard work oftentimes. It's we want to get a quick fix. I mean, when I started this treatment and also working with it as a therapist, because I've gone both as a client and as a therapist, I became keenly aware of how much in trauma we want to figure it out in our heads and get it straight in our heads and get somebody to give us the right answer. So it's going to all be clear and then it'll go away. But that's just not how it happens. It happens through the hard work of peeling back the layers of the onion and doing the healing work. And it's why whenever I work with people, I mean, I'm retired now. I only do training, but that you wind up working with people when you do that too. But when I would have clients, I asked them to be in 12-step programs, in one-to-one therapy. I have a group practice. I had a group practice. And I knew that what came up in group was going to be evocative. They need one-to-one therapy, maybe not once a week, maybe twice a week. When it's coming up, they need program and they need access to it all the time, because once this stuff comes up, you need a very good solid container. You also need to change the way you eat. You can't eat a bunch of sweets. You can't drink. You can't, what are the other trigger foods? All the white flour foods, all of that kind of stuff. It's stuff that spikes your system, that makes your system unstable. If your eating is out of control, you're not going to recover. If you're smoking, it's going to get in the way of your recovery. If you're exercising too much, it's going to get in the way. If you're a love act, it's going to get in the way. If you're, I'm trying to think of what else it might be, but all of those things will interfere with your recovery as an ACOA, because we're dealing with trauma resolution and it's deep. And it's it's disequilibrating when you start to do it. But every time you're disequilibrated, if you can understand, it's a step up in establishing your better equilibrium. So not to fear being slightly disequilibrated. Get it and then find your way out of it. But find your way out of it by slowing down, by feeling the feeling, by articulating it, by sharing it, by listening as others share theirs, by seeking support. I think is there an easy answer to your question? I don't know. I mean, I'd have to know what happened before you were 7. I'd have to know the nature of your father, your relationship with him, mother, what's your role towards your mother? What was your thinking about yourself at the time? What did it give you a sense of empowerment? Did it give you a sense of fear? There would be so many factors that would need to be responsibly teased out to give you the answer that would be helpful to you. But you ultimately, if you're in a healing process, I talk about that in the Soulful Journey of Recovery, you don't even need the answers, because what happens, and you learn this in a 12-step program, if you really put your souls in the room, as we say, the answers reveal themselves as you feel the feelings. And those answers are worth their weight in gold because they're yours. So I would say the offhand answer, and the one that I want to, send with a message to your listeners, may or may not apply to them or even to you, is that if you made it to age 7 relatively solidly, you got a good shot at being well.
Yeah,
you really do. You've got a lot. You've got a lot formed by 7. You've got a lot of stability by 7. And what I try to do with clients is get back to that child that felt better about themselves, get back to the child that was less destabilized, get back, because what trauma does is it causes us to lose touch with the part of ourselves that was stronger, because we just get so stuck in the reenactment and the reliving of the trauma every time we get close to getting close. Every time we get triggered, we start to relive. And if we don't understand that, if we don't back it up and say, what am I reliving now? How can I experience this and learn from it, instead of just throwing it at the person who's triggering it? Throwing at the person who's triggering it isn't going to change it inside of us. We need to live through it and see what it's telling us about ourselves. And I'm just losing my train of thought now. If we If we can do that, then the answers start to come clear in 12-step rooms, group therapy, one-to-one therapy. All of these create a container full of safe triggers. And if you've been in therapy or group therapy or 12-step, you start thinking everyone in the room is crazy and they're out to get you at certain points in your trauma work, because you think, oh my God, what am I doing? They're making me feel depressed again, and they're making me feel anxious, and this must be a really bad place to be. Or my therapist must be, and this is tricky because some therapists aren't good, and they should be left. A lot of what's happening is that we're getting triggered and we're reliving our own trauma and projecting it, making it about the person who's triggering it.
Mm-hmm.
So it's complex.
What about, you talk a lot about in your books, but just like the minimization of what we went through, like what would you have to say versus does a certain form of trauma or abuse like trump another? Can somebody who is just emotionally neglected be as impacted as someone who was physically abused?
Good question. And yes, absolutely. I used to find it easier to treat people who'd been physically abused than neglected. It's very, think about it. If you don't want to get punished in a jail, you're put into solitary confinement. If in a sect you're shunned, we are pack animals. And one of the most painful experiences for pack animals is to be shunned or isolated. That's one thing COVID is doing. It is throwing everybody back on their own inner resources because we're having to sit still. We're having to not distract ourselves. So it can be both a very triggering time and a time to really work through issues that are related to COVID. Mm-hmm. Not related to COVID, but issues that are getting triggered by COVID, but that are getting triggered because as a child we felt trapped, and in COVID we feel trapped. Mm-hmm. As a child we felt helpless, and in COVID we felt helpless. Mm-hmm. And add to that the gaslighting that's going on right now politically. And as a child we felt gaslighted, and there was massive denial, and that is existing now in the world we're in. This podcast will last far beyond that experience. Does that answer your question? So I like to help people connect with the person they were before the trauma took hold and got them lost in the reenacting. Mm-hmm. And once they do that, it's a very resilience building thing. Mm-hmm. The way you do that is through going through the pain that's blocking it. Mm-hmm. And the vulnerability. You see, that child had capacity to be vulnerable, but we need to get the vulnerability back too.
When did, I'm not exactly sure when the Red Book changed from adult children of alcoholics to include also dysfunctional families? And just for
about 5 years ago, I think. Actually.
Oh, wow. That's pretty recent. Could you give some examples of dysfunctional families that wouldn't include, alcoholism?
Well, let's reverse that, because what I find interesting about addiction is that, this ACE studies, I'm sure you're familiar with adverse childhood experiences, talk about, they didn't expect addiction to pop up necessarily. They were just trying to figure out what got adults into doctor's appointments. They wanted to look at the factors that made people sick as adults. And they discovered a massive mind-body connection, that childhood trauma manifests as adult diabetes, cancer, heart condition, body aches, all back problems, fibromyalgia, you name it. So, but addiction kept popping up for them as a very high factor. And what that means is because addiction is never alone, right? It clusters. Things tend to cluster around addiction: neglect, abuse, emotional regulation issues, eating issues, sexual abuse, obviously raging. All of those tend to be clustering factors that are part of addiction. Now, if you grow up like that as an ACOA, you'll just go right out, and maybe you don't use the booze or the drugs, but you go straight to food. You're a rager. You're a neglecter. You're an avoider. You use work. You use exercise. You use food. You use sex to regulate yourself. So is that part of a dysfunctional family? Yeah, I would say dysfunctional families where people can't feel their vulnerability. They can't talk things over. They can't connect with each other, and they can't work as a team. They can't pull together and be a team. They can't have common goals, so that all of the hurt that happens in that family can't be resolved. So it just forms this bigger and bigger snowball that starts to, it's the elephant in the living room, gets fatter and fatter and fatter because there's so much that's not talked about. And then you start to you feel pain around that. You question your identity, you question your reality, you question yourself, your capacity to be a good person, your capacity to have meaningful relationships. So all of that, and then pretty soon you find weed, you find beer, you find liquor, you find drugs, and so that's what they used to call skipping a generation. That addiction never skipped a generation. Just that part of addiction skipped a generation. There's no skipping a generation.
No, none.
You might ask yourself, if I were working with you, I'd say, were there grandparents who were, addicts, or what was their profile, for example? I would ask you that if you feel like answering it.
Oh, yeah. It's both sides. I didn't stand a chance.
What were your grandparents?
Grandmother on one side, alcoholic. Grandfather on the other side, alcoholic.
See, so there you go. That's a very typical setup. Your mother then is the alcoholic and your father is the enabler. He knows what to do when he marries an alcoholic, right? Mm-hmm. You keep your mouth shut. You ask your kids to come in and manage it, and you take off. You get a job where you're gone during the week. This is such a classic pattern.
Wow.
You don't get treatment. You don't get it for yourself. You keep it silent. You keep it under the rug. You keep it manageable, and you sacrifice the kids. And then you deny how bad it is, and you just say, no problem, your kids can be okay. And you think by saying mom's a drunk, so you're being really open or something,
Yeah, exactly.
And we used to also think if you shove the alcoholic into treatment, the family would get better. Mm-hmm. But the rest of the family got sick alongside the alcoholic. So everybody needs treatment.
No kidding. Now, what about, I think one of my favorite things that you have in emotional sobriety is where you talk about when one member of the family starts to seek treatment, like for these issues, and the rest of the family sees that as a threat and retaliates. And I was wondering if you could kind of touch upon that.
Well, that is, I could share my own experience, which was so clear to me. I was in 8th grade. My father was mandated in those days. You could mandate someone into a mental health facility. He refused treatment, so he was taken away. White jacket. Literally with. Not by a white jacket, but in one of those jackets.
Straight jacket. Yeah.
They tie behind their back. And he became very, very suffocating once they put him in that, and went to a mental health place to dry out, and dried out and got, my father was a binge drinker, so he looked great when he dried out. And then he had to go to Hazelden from there. That was part of the mandate. He went to Hazelden and lo and behold, left early because he'd gotten it, right? He understood everything, and he decided to leave because they probably got into, by accident, trauma work. There was no trauma work back then, but they probably just got vulnerable, and it was just too much for him. So he came home looking wonderful, seeming like my old dad. And we sat on the balcony. He had a glass of water. He said, "This is my drink from now on, my only drink." And I remember the family circling around him, looking so angry and mistrustful. And no one was happy for him. No one was happy for themselves. It was so distressing to recognize that. And even in 8th grade, I remember thinking, he'll never stay sober. Mm. He'll never stay sober because everybody's so angry. And He didn't, and we didn't, because we didn't know anything about the family illness in those days. We didn't know how ill we had become. And we had gotten used to blaming one person. And by God, that has never changed. Our family has always looked for that scapegoat to blame. And I would say we have outlived that disease because we all kind of recognize that, we're smart people. We know what happened, but our dynamic never shifted out of that. We just outgrew it and kind of gave it up. We just don't feel like being mad at each other anymore. And we'd like to get along. So we're nice to each other, and we do love each other. But we never stopped that dynamic. It's worn out. We exhausted ourselves out of it, but not because we talked about it or identified it as a family or clarified the dynamics within our family. And it wasn't because we didn't try. I dragged my family into therapy on several occasions, but it really requires that a dysfunctional family, each one takes responsibility for the disease inside of them and embraces recovery. And it's very hard to get everybody to come to Jesus moment all together, Mm-hmm. So that's sort of how I see it happening. But there's a more enlightened world now. And I think people in younger generations, I hope, pray that they're less threatened about talking about their feelings. In my era, I'm 70.
Look amazing.
Thank you. Nobody talked about their feelings. That would have been like, why are you saying that? Now you go to, living in New York City, you go to any restaurant anywhere in any part of New York City, everybody's talking about their feelings. That's the nature. You eavesdrop on conversations down the block, people are talking about their feelings. So the emotional intelligence of our country has really elevated. Now, could you tell that by looking at the state of our country right now? No. But we are integrating many, many, many cultures, and we will find it again because that's what America does. That's my feeling. That's what we do. We find our equilibrium and we educate ourselves. And when education once meant literacy, I think that today's education also means emotional literacy.
I guess kind of like in closing, the one thing that I wanted to ask you, and, I've asked Mary, my therapist, the same question. I mean, you have spent 35 plus years in this field and you have helped so many people, like whether it's through your books or working with them one-on-one or training other therapists. And I just wonder, are you able to kind of like to touch into that? And like when you reflect back on that, just the sense of gratitude, like how does, you've really impacted the lives of so many people for the better. And it's quite amazing.
First of all, thank you. That is a very generous thing to say. And I say, what I think, in all honesty, I don't go around thinking that per se, but I feel good about my life. I feel like with my children, I wasn't a perfect mother, but what I had to give, I gave. I gave it my best shot, and they know it. I think children don't need perfection. I think they need to know you gave it your best shot. And you get a lot of credit for that. And with my children, now I have grandchildren, I'm not perfect by any stretch, but I'm giving it my best shot. And when I goof up, which is regular, I ask for forgiveness. I got mad at my little 7-year-old grandson for turning the Vitamix on. We were making tomato soup. It went all over the kitchen. And when we did it the next time, I said, I got mad at you for that. Do you forgive me? And he said, we all make mistakes. We all make. And, so I think I've tried to walk my walk and talk my, walk my walk, not just talk my talk. But I think I feel satisfied. And I think the reason you're asked, or the reason I hear inside of that question is something to do with I've done day to day, just, what I could do. I've put my sleeves up and I have done the work of helping. And I think that is a tremendously satisfying way to live, not to just have a fantasy of speaking and writing books and stuff like that, but day after day after day, just really helping people in an organized kind of a way. And we all have a way to do that. And you don't have to be a therapist to do that. This is doing that, this podcast. And everybody in business, people do that. You know, some business people can be so wonderful. Teachers, every profession, plumbers, every profession you are in, you can live like that. And then I think you'll feel very good about your life by the time you get to my age, if you just tried to contribute to the world. Because that's a very long answer, but
no, it's beautiful. Well, thank you so much. As I said when I reached out to you before, even though we had never met before today, your books have just had a real tremendous impact on my life. And speaking, I was getting a little bit emotional last night when I was thinking about talking to you today, and just where I was. I mean, there's still so much more work to be done, but this podcast and speaking to you and your books that have had such an impact on me, it's all kind of coming full circle. And I'm just so grateful for people like you who are kind of the pioneers in this and have given so many of us a chance to heal from our dysfunctional upbringings. It truly is, I think, the most profound work that we can do. And I'm just so grateful that people like you have figured it out for the rest of us, whether we want to do the work or not. That's another question, but I'm so grateful that there's at least the example, the opportunity to do the work. And seriously, from the bottom of my heart, like, I thank you so much. You have helped me so much. So I just want to extend that gratitude to you.
I have to tell you that what I really wanted to call my book was a love letter to ACOA, because I wanted to do just what you said I've done. And if I have helped you, I'm happy.
Thank you. Yeah. Well, I will be posting links to your website, to all your books. I'm one of your biggest promoters. I'll go stand on the sidewalk and hold your books and dance. And we're just excited to see, 70 years young. What else can you give us? I'm waiting for more. Do you have anything that you're working on now? Any books or anything?
Well, I sort of, I'll just answer that question. There are two. And I haven't really even, I think I want to do an emotional sobriety and relationships. And also a book called Sociometrics on the processes I use to heal. So those are the two that run around my mind right now.
I usually say at this point, I hope you heard something that can help you on your own journey, but I know you did. And if you didn't, you got some issues, okay? Like I said, I am so grateful for Tian. We all need to be so damn grateful for Tian and all the other adult child pioneers who have trudged the path to freedom and recovery. Check out the show notes for links to her books as well as other resources. And now it's time for Hit a Girl Up. So I received a message on TikTok from Michelle who asked, what if you can't remember anything from your childhood? And Michelle, I was actually just having this conversation with a friend of mine. I am somebody who has a very vivid memory of everything that happened during my childhood, but my friend is somebody who does not remember a lot. And I think that that's very common for adult children. What I would say is that if you are asking this question, if anyone is asking this question, there must be some sort of an inclination that something wasn't right, that something was dysfunctional, or we wouldn't even be asking the question. So I think it's about starting with what you do remember, even if that is very little, and unpacking that, as well as to identify how we are feeling in the present, what laundry list trait or limiting belief is causing us pain in our lives today, and asking ourselves, can I remember a time in my past during my childhood where I felt this way? Now, the answer might not come right away. And this also goes to my point on how important it is to work with a really good therapist who knows what questions to ask and can aid in safely bringing these memories to the surface. But of course, like all this healing shit, it doesn't happen overnight, but it will if we stay committed to doing the work. If you have a question, comment, insight, I would love to hear from you. Hit a girl up. See show notes for more details on that. So next episode, we are diving deeper into complex PTSD because this is a topic that is so fucking important.